Welcome to the Elevate Podcast, a resource designed to take your ministry to the next level. Your church's impact. This podcast is here to equip you with practical for today's episode. And we're diving into one of the most critical aspects of the church's leadership, investing in healthy group leaders and building layers of lay leadership. A strong small group ministry isn't just about gathering people. It's about developing leaders who disciple others, creating a multiplying effect that strengthens the entire church. Joining me for this conversation are Alec and Jo Girardier, who both bring firsthand experience in equipping leaders and multiplying groups in the local church. Let's just go ahead and get started. Would you mind talking about where you specifically serve and what you do that involves groups? Jo, how about you kick us off?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to be here. This is so fun. I'm the women's minister on the Brentwood Campus, and I serve with our women leaders and volunteers and have been here for 23 years, I think. Yeah, it's about that.
I have not been here for 23 years, but I serve at our Laughlin Springs campus, which is in East Nashville, and I oversee our small groups as well as our missions, local and international. Our Laughlin Springs campus is pretty small, so the dynamics with leaders and recruiting and things like that are a little different, but yeah, it's pretty fun.
Yeah. And then I serve currently at our West Franklin campus in the role of groups and care. So everything from life groups to Bible reading groups to men and women's groups. But I started in the residency program here at our Avenue South campus. Yeah. And so it's been kind of really cool to see Brentwood, the different campus models, and what groups look like at each campus. Yeah. So I just want to start off with kind of a question about kind of experience. Where have you seen in your own experience some of the biggest gaps when it comes to groups and group leadership?
You kick us off.
Yeah, I mean, I'll go. I would say this is looking at gap a little differently maybe, but I think oftentimes as leaders, we look at a gap, meaning like we need somebody to fill that gap, right? And so sometimes I think one of the rookie moves we can make is to just put a warm body in a spot. And so one of the things that I have learned through the years, I'm sure that you guys have done this too, but recognizing the need to just really pray for the people that we need and just praying for the right leaders to come into those spaces, because that makes all the difference. I don't know if you guys have ever experienced like toxic leadership or anything like that. And I think that happens when you just put somebody in a spot.
Yeah.
And so I want to make sure that I'm just submitting and surrendering and saying, Lord, help me know you have provided the resources, you know the people that you're bringing to our spaces and places, and he sees it before, I'm going to see that. So just praying for that first, right? So anyway, I know that's kind of the
I feel like if you're throwing warm bodies into, like, they're just going to sweat, right? That's all they're going to do.
Right.
And that's not helpful for anybody. I think for us, like, especially at a smaller campus, the gap that I have seen the most is between calling and competency. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people, they like when you bring up leading a group or leadership in general, they'll just say, well, I'm just not called to that. And what they mean is, I don't think that I can do that. I don't feel like I'm equipped. Yeah. I don't think that my backstory or my training is enough to do that. And so they confuse that idea of calling and competency. So I think it's on us to kind of tease that out for them and help them separate something they're called to do versus something that they can do within leadership in their local church.
That's good. Do you feel like that even comes from, asking questions, is that bad?
Can I do that? This is great.
Okay. Yeah, come on.
Do you think that happens more along the line of creating almost like a pipeline where you can invite them in to, I know, and I used to do student ministry here a long time ago. And one of the ways that I would just kind of bring people along that I was praying for, and I saw in them before they saw in them, right, that they could lead, is just going, just come on, almost like an apprentice, but like here's a really small part of what you could lead out in. And then they were able to kind of like a mentorship sort of thing, informally see what it looked like to lead. And so they were taking more and more, but instead of putting the weight of it on somebody, I don't know. How do you?
Yeah, I would say that approach is far wiser, especially with younger leaders that are still kind of learning who they are. I think for seasoned leaders, I'm okay putting the weight on them. And because a lot of times for us, like what we've seen is they have the skill sets. They can do it. There's just a willingness obstacle in the way. And so I think the burden of responsibility can be helpful for them to know, like, hey, I'm not just asking you to run a social club. Like, I'm not just trying to organize a time for you to hang out with friends. Like, I'm calling you to lead, disciple, and steward this group of people in their relationship with Jesus, as well as their relationship with the local church. So it could be a both and, but I think it just kind of depends on the situation.
I love both y'all's responses, because when we talk about gaps, that can mean a lot of different things. A gap for some leaders could be a literal chasm where they literally can't get across it because they don't have the resources or the ability.
Yeah.
For others, a gap may look like a pothole or a road bump where it's not helpful, it's not good. We don't want our leaders to go through that. And so one thing that both y'all drew on that I think is really important is this really starts with group leaders and leadership. Oftentimes we think of groups, we think, how can we start more groups? Churches constantly want to start more groups. We feel that need. Some campuses or some churches may deal with the problem where it's like we have too many people and not enough leaders. Others may look at it, we have a lot of leaders, but we need more people to come for the groups. And so one of the questions I want to start with is, I think we both realize is we don't need just more groups, but more healthy groups. And that starts with first multiplying great healthy group leaders. And so how do you all invest in group leaders first? And why is that more important than just launching groups?
I can't think but go to like the old adage, right? You can't like lead others until you lead yourself. I think that like our campus is small, and give a little context about your campus. Yeah, so like our campus is like kind of east of downtown. It's I would say anywhere between 100 to 150 people who are there on a semi-weekly basis. We're a very transient community. We've got a lot of musicians, a lot of people who are on the road. And so a lot of our members and even leaders are there for 2 weeks, gone for 3, or there for 6 weeks and then gone for 12 weeks because they're in Australia performing with some really talented person. And so I think for us, like we recognize and we need our leaders to lead themselves before we ask them to lead other people, or the burnout, or I think the spiritual trauma that will come down the road is like, that's just a cycle we're going to have a hard time climbing out of. And so that's something that I try as often as I can to make sure that our leaders recognize. But then you also have to ask, like, okay, so how are you going to do that? Like, what are the rhythms that you're taking? Like, are you praying for your group before you meet? Like, what does your preparation look like? Are you just showing up on a Wednesday night kind of thinking to yourself, I got 20 minutes to figure out what I'm going to talk about? Or like, have you spent time praying and preparing for what's ahead? So
that's good. I would say soul care is important too, right? Like that's essentially some of the things that you're talking about is just giving them resources for them to know what it looks like and to prioritize that. I think that was something that our former pastor here at Brentwood had done so well for a lot of us, is just showing us how important it was to take care of your soul. And so that's one of the things that we try to do with our leaders as well, is give them resources to take care of their soul as they're, pouring out all the time, make sure that they're pouring back in. And then really just spending time and checking in with them. It's hard sometimes when you do all the work to like launch groups and then, but it's really important to go back and check in and say, how are we doing now? So we just launched, for women, we just launched a new mentoring program, and we're running it on Brentwood Campus and Harpeth Heights. And our team did a lot of work on vetting the leaders and vetting the mentors and the mentees. And now we're about almost 2 months in, and we're having to go back in and check back in, because you just want to keep on letting them know you're there. So I think it's important to help with the health of a group leader, to let them know that they're not alone, right? So,
Can I ask, like, when you talk about soul care, when you're thinking about how to equip and give resources to your leaders, what are the resources, like, apart from scripture, that you guys lean into the most? Like, is there a set list? Like, is it pretty organic? Like, how does that work for you guys?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think some of those things are tools, like helping them in their spiritual disciplines. So I know for our mentors, we just gave, and our mentees, we gave them scripture prayer cards, like how are different ways that we're either resources that we're using ourselves. I know for some of our female female ministers on staff, we are pouring into them using a soul care cohort that's soulcare.com. So it's helping them take an assessment to even see if they're in burnout. And so we can do that for our group leaders as well, so they can kind of see, am I in a healthy place or not? So I think, giving them assessments, giving them resources, telling them this is obviously, like Dwell is a scripture-based. Have you guys heard of
So
Dwell?
great. Those
Okay.
voices are so soothing.
I know. Do you have a favorite one? I always have a favorite one. I always
they're
have
all
like
great. Yeah.
some music in the background.
Yeah.
It feels a
Okay.
little bit more dramatic, but
I can't do music because I get
Oh.
distracted, and then I
Okay.
start
Do you-
singing or I start humming, and then
okay. They have a crackling fire as well. Have you tried that one?
No, but maybe
Sometimes
that's
it's
what I need.
campfire,
Yeah.
campfire. Anyway, that's a resource. So
Sure.
we have been providing that subscription for 2 years for our
wow.
leaders.
Yeah.
So yeah, we can also see how many minutes they're using. So it's kind of nice.
Oh, wow. I love it. Yeah. So when they come and they say, hey, I feel really burnt out, you can say, well, it's because you haven't been on Dwell in 2 months.
See that you've been out. Yeah.
You should try this
It's
for
not
a
that
leader instead too.
specific.
Yeah.
That'd be great.
I think one major theme I've heard both you saying, especially you, Amy Jo, like emphasizing the importance of soul care and pouring in spiritually to your leaders. I think that's something as group ministers at churches who are busy, that can often be something that they skip over.
Yeah.
Because they see launching a group as being kind of the finish point. And that's really the
Right.
starting line for that group.
That's a good point. Yeah.
And so I think what some of the things that you've said, whether it's through kind of Bible reading apps, whether it's through praying for them, I think it's easy as group leaders to think about and speak about the process, think about the purpose, but lose track of the person.
Yeah, that's a
Because
good
what we
way
want
of
to do
saying
is
it.
we want to develop the people, our leaders itself. Can you think of a time, I'm sure you all can, difference?
Yes, I can think of a time.
It's good.
So we've got one of our leaders, he and his wife, they're fantastic. And they started like 5 to 10 years ago a nonprofit that essentially existed to train leaders like globally. And so this nonprofit, not only trains leaders, but it creates resources, it creates pipelines and different things. And so I've been in his group multiple times when he's pulled out a resource that they've used, that they know are tested, that they know work, and he's used it on our people. And it was just like, man, this was easy, like making this connection. And but it's even cool to see the way that like that's what he does as a profession. Like that's how he earns a living, and yet the Lord is using it in multifaceted ways to carry it across, the kingdom and impact in different ways. So that was really cool to see that pairing come together and watch them sort of organically use the things that they've been doing for a long time to lead their group to spiritual flourishing.
Yeah.
I like that a lot. I was trying to think of a good one as well, and I think it's always when you see the right leader, it's always an encouragement because it's God at work behind that, right?
Yeah.
So we have weekly in the women's ministry. We have a Wednesday night. It's called midweek. It's very creative. Because it's in the middle of the week. Do you get that? Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So
That's clever.
midweek, feel free to use it. But we have a worship time, and then we break out into small groups, and so we have a bunch of tables, and we're walking through things together. And so we have one table. All of our tables are great, in case they're listening to this. But table 7, that leader was walking through some things that it seemed to be. A lot of women at that table were walking through health things, and the Lord just really put that table together. And we have just seen them just grow, and the pastoral care concerns and things that were going on at that table were huge. And we had the right leader at that time. I could not have orchestrated that. It was just clear that the Lord was doing that, and she was. She was in the right place at the right time, and so we've really seen them flourish.
And that's like a God thing right there.
Right.
Because that
There's
was none
no
of your
way.
planning, none of
No.
your orchestrating.
Other than praying, I mean, we do have like a prayer team that prays for all of our groups, And so I was able to go to them and say, look at what the Lord is doing. Thank you for praying for this. So, yeah.
Sometimes the right leader is kind of brought by God. Sometimes the right leader is someone with a skill set. I think of one of my leaders. When I first came to the West Franklin campus a year and a half ago, there was a group that was just honestly struggling, and a lot of it was the leader did not feel like he was capable, right? He had come from a kind of more of a Sunday school-based background. He's like, I'm not the best lecturer or teacher, but he was a great person at asking questions. And so it took meeting with him for a few weeks, kind of encouragement of that. And over time, I love their group. Even today, he's still a group leader, him and his wife. And they do an amazing job of just creating an environment for just like openness, prayer, and the conversation. And I'll walk by sometimes and there's tears in that class because they're crying through things together. He would not call himself the right leader, right? Because in his mind, this is what a leader looks like. And but when you kind of reorient and reframe, hey, maybe for this class, this is the right leader, right?
Yeah.
And so again,
that.
I think it's helping bring the people along where that's kind of a gap. These ideas, what leadership looks like, but encouraging them in that. So
I would say too, if I love being able to watch those leaders grow too into that. You know, they were at the right place, and now they're just you're like, yes, you're the right leader for this. But my co-leader at my table group, I got to recruit her when in student ministry world, and now we get to do women's ministry together. But cool. She originally was, I kind of recruited her like, hey, you can come and be a part of what your daughter's being a part of, like kind of brought her in that way. And she did not feel like the right leader then. And she has just grown into sometimes just sitting at the table. I'm in awe of what the Lord has done as he's grown her and prepared her. And so I love being able to have longevity, just being able to see, like what that looks like. So anyway.
Well, I'm sure most of the disciples, when Jesus said, hey, come follow me, were like, what?
Right.
You want me to do what? Like, I don't feel like I'm the right person for this. But I think that willingness really is so vital when it comes to leadership. Like just a willingness to take that first step is something that I think is not natural within a lot of us. It can be kind of coaxed out, like you used a real situation and kind of offered that opportunity to her, but she still had to take that first step.
That's right.
And now she is, however many years later, leading a table of women and is taking steps on her own. And that's just like a beautiful part of discipleship, of extending an invitation, trusting the Spirit to be the one to kind of give the nudge, but then watching that person take those steps is so encouraging to see that happen.
I want to double click on something you're talking about, Alec. Like, what are some key characteristics of leaders? So, because you're looking for it, some of these are God brought them along and it opens up. But oftentimes we're doing a lot of the labor and the work, finding leaders, whether that's through group situations or just one-on-one. What are some key characteristics that you would say you look for when you're trying to identify potential leaders?
I really value flexibility, like adaptability, like a leader who can, whether it's a conversation topic or whether it's the opinions of their group, who can kind of ebb and flow and is not just kind of coming in like a hammer and saying, no, this is how we do it. This is how I was told to do it. So this is how we're going to do it. That might work for some people, but I think the majority of people who are looking to belong to a group, hopefully are looking to belong to something, again, more than just a club. Like that is part of their spiritual family. And in a spiritual family, everybody's voice carries weight. Everybody wants to be heard, wants to be seen and known. And so a leader who can discern kind of where those things are going, but still keep it where it needs to go. Like if it just goes off the rails, that's not going to help anybody.
No.
And I've been a part of those groups. I will say they are very fun. But
super fun.
There's not a lot of great things that come out of that over time.
True.
But a leader who can just kind of like say, I've got a plan, but I'm not so tied to this plan where if it goes over here, well, then the whole night is just lost.
Yeah.
It's true.
It's good. It's really good. Have you ever misjudged someone's readiness, though?
Never.
Because there's perfect. Okay.
Yes, I have.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think we all have, right? So.
Yeah, so it's easy to misjudge that. It depends on what your rubric or what you're grading it on. Like, what are the key characteristics that you're looking for? I think one thing that if I was listening to this podcast or coming to this conference, like I would want to know, how do you cultivate a culture of this, though? How do you cultivate a culture of leadership development? Because I think one of the biggest problems you see in churches is there's always a need to start a new group. right? You look over here and say, hey, these young singles there's a huge group of them. How do we find a leader? Or, hey, there's a group of women that we need to help. And it's like, here's a need, let's find a leader and plug them in. But then you're having to train up leaders really, really fast, and you're plugging holes instead of creating a culture that allows for leaders to come up. Do you all know any ways how you can cultivate maybe a culture that would allow for leadership development to be very organic?
It's a good question. I think for us, again, because of our size, like one of the things that we try and emphasize with our leaders is not just the what, but the why. So why do we do small groups to begin with? Yeah. Why is it a good thing for you to lead? What's the why of your group? Like, is there a goal? Is there not necessarily an end point, but like, where do you envision this group going? Because I have found so many leaders, again, they're just jumping in because they're eager to serve, or maybe they feel like they're convicted and they need to serve, but they never really stop and think about, why am I doing this? Like, what's the direction I want these people to go? And so that could be something as small as like, do you want this group to have an end date? Like, or is this a 1 to 2 year commitment for you? Is this a 5 to 6 year commitment? What does that look like? Because again, if the purpose of our groups is to multiply, which for us, that's huge, especially at a small campus, like we don't just want everybody to be in a group with their friends, because what happens is these silos build up and it actually creates disunity rather than unity across the group's ministry. And so we want our groups to multiply, but that has to be something that the leader has thought about before they even get started. Because I think it shapes what they study, how long they study it, the kind of conversations that they're having with their people. Yeah. Because if they're going to multiply, then most likely they're looking within that group of who can be the one to take the multiplication out of here. Like, who's the leader that I can identify? And that could change the way they talk to this person, disciple that person, however they want to approach it. But I think knowing the purpose, knowing your why is the best kind of, for us, like cultural point that we try to hit on as much as we can.
I think celebrating transformation in a group too is huge, you know, just taking a chance to say, how are you seeing God at work? That is going to be inspiring, and people want to be a part of that. Yeah. So we've seen, especially, going back to midweek or going back to our mentoring, we're building in some everybody's together. So, you know, all the groups come together, all the mentors and mentees come together. And we're celebrating, we're reminding them, we're asking the question, how are you seeing God at work? And I think that when you start doing that, then people are like, I want to do more. I want to do more in this group, you know? Yeah. And then the invitation of, at the end of each season, hey, we're growing. Here's what's happening. Is it something that maybe the Lord's stirring? And if you want to talk about doing that, come and talk with me about that. But also, looking for opportunities to partner them with somebody who's taking that on, and asking leaders themselves to say, do you see anybody at your table? Do you see anybody at your group that you identified as possible leadership, you know? So
I think that partnership's key. I think leadership development happens more in relationships than we give credit to. And so I think whether that is in a small group setting, having leaders identify who's that kind of that second or third batter, whether that's giving them teaching opportunities, giving them, if they have a gifting of hospitality, or letting them have those opportunities, and giving them kind of looks at the basket when it comes to that. Yeah. I think oftentimes that I've seen in my experience is you have great dynamic leaders, and it becomes very personality driven, and they do a great job, but they only have so much depth that they can give, and that group will only grow to a certain size. And so when they allow other people to come in and teach, use their giftings of hospitality or other things, it allows for them to develop leaders as well, where it's not about just their personality in the group, but also how from here can we multiply that out and make sure that everyone in the church is using their giftings. And
I think tying those two together of celebration and like those giftings, like if we aren't celebrating the unique giftings of our leaders, then why would they? Like, why would they buy into it? Yeah, if it's hospitality, because there's the temptation within leadership, right, to overvalue or over prioritize different giftings. Like, oh, well, I would love to have the gift of teaching, but I just got stuck with hospitality. But like, that's not a healthy way to look at that. Like, hospitality is so necessary, especially in something like groups ministry. Yeah. So not only just like identifying that, but celebrating it regularly, I think builds that culture of, oh no, we all have our parts to play here, and all of our parts, like the hand cannot say to the foot, like, you're not necessary. Like, we all need each other. We all have something valuable to bring, and we celebrate that regularly. I think that is just a helpful thing to do.
Yeah. So let's say you find the leader, right? We've identified that leader. We see that they have certain giftings maybe, or we've kind of developed them in a way. How would you say is we can best equip them? Because, again, I think we all agree here. If we find a leader, we don't say good for you, have a good time leading your group. We know it's just the beginning of it.
See you later.
Yeah.
So what are some
back in.
non-negotiables when it comes to training new leaders? What would you say is these are things you have to do in order to allow for that leader to have a successful chance of helping lead those people?
I mean, we do a leader vetting. I think that maybe, I'm assuming that maybe has happened at some point, but a leader vetting, I think also whatever tools that you're asking them to use, you're going to equip them with, but also making sure that they understand the mission and vision of the group that they're leading. Those are some of the things that I think are non-negotiables.
I think that's huge, especially that mission and vision part.
Right.
Yeah, I think like not just knowing the DNA of your group's ministry, but and not even just handing it on a sheet of paper to your leaders, but again, explaining to them and showing them like why these are the things we've prioritized. Like, so for us, the 5 Gs are huge and they're important, right?
Yeah.
But I think
break that down real fast. We say 5 Gs. So what do we mean by that?
So this is kind of like a paradigm that we can use to kind of explain how we do ministry, right? So let's see if we all know them, right? We've got give, go, gather. Groups. There
it
we
is.
go.
I was like, wait, what is it?
That's 5, right? Is that 4?
Gospel conversations.
And gospel.
Oh,
Can't forget that.
And that
There
one.
it is.
It finds its way in every now and
Gospel
then.
conversation.
But, and again, like even right there, like there's a moment where I'm like, oh man, do I know these? and I, just had this conversation the other day of like something like the gospel. It's not a single use only. Like we need to revisit it and we need to meditate on it every day because our mind wanders, gaps are created. And when gaps are created, lies are believed and that sort of thing. So as our leaders are thinking about how and why they do these things, continuing to put before them the essence of what we're trying to do. Like I had a leader several years ago who I have a great deal of respect for, who always reminded me, she would bring me into an office, draw like a bucket, and then like make a note on the side that vision leaks. Like over time, each of us have a mental bucket of vision that we're being, given. But over time it leaks and everybody's has a leak. It starts to fade out, it starts to slip, and before you know it, I'm like, why am I doing this? Like why are we doing this? So constantly coming back, refilling that bucket, I think is a non-negotiable for me as I try to steward that ministry well. Now I don't always do that perfectly, right? And I've got to have my own systems of checks and balances to make sure that I do that. But that's something that I try to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about, how vision leaks, kind of culture starts from the top. It kind of starts with us. You even mentioned that early on, right? Talking about you can't take people where you haven't yourself gone.
Yeah.
And so as you're kind of meeting with your group leaders, is there any way that you all specifically do check-ins with them? Any ways that you help kind of coach them up along the way that you think has been really beneficial? Because again, everyone has different. There's not one solid way of doing it. I'm sure each of you all do it slightly differently, but anything that you all see that's really helpful when it comes to helping train and equip your leaders?
Yeah, it has to be centered around caffeine. So like whatever you're doing, there's got to be caffeine there. But no, for us, and again, this is not possible for like larger campuses, I think, at the same level. But I've just found so much value in just going to the groups and sitting there with them and saying, I have no agenda. I am simply here to sit and to be with you. I'm not going to critique you. I'm not going to send you an email the next day, though if I need to, I will. But like, I just want you to know that I see you and that I'm here for you. I have not abandoned you. Again, it's that I didn't say see you later and, I'll check in next fall. But it's like a ministry of presence of just knowing that like, I, as the staff member, am on your team. I am your advocate, and I am so proud of you.
Yeah.
Like that's something that like our campus pastor especially does such a great job of. We don't tell our leaders that we're proud of them enough.
Yeah.
And if we do, it's like a very casual, like, "Hey, proud of you. See you later," because it can be awkward, right? You got to sit in that. But like looking someone in the eye, taking the time to like say, "Hey, I am so proud of you. I know what you're doing is hard, but it's worthy and you're doing a good job." Like that just that just goes a long way, I think.
Yeah, and meaning
Really
it
good.
though.
Yeah.
I mean, you can say those words, but then
Yeah.
it's like, oh,
Well, people can sniff that out too.
that's true.
If it's
Oh.
a tagline
So
at the
yeah.
end of an email,
authentic.
right?
Yeah.
There's an authentic.
Yeah.
I think it also comes with the realization as if your role is in groups ministry or in some form of groups ministry, there are multiple, hopefully, groups and there's leaders. This would not exist if they weren't doing that, right? And so we're coming alongside them in the ministry of this. And so I think that's really good.
I think encouragement in different ways too. Like notes of encouragement. I know that we've tried to do that with with different people, bringing a team along. I think also realizing if you do have a bigger ministry that you're overseeing, you're not going to be able to do it all. So make sure that you have a team of people that are great about checking in and encouraging. I think cookies are great.
Okay.
If you can bring cookies in.
Cookies and caffeine.
Yeah, cookies and
and
caffeine.
caffeine.
There it
That'd be a
is.
fun
That's a
group.
new Bible study.
That's a Bible study right
There
there.
it
Someone
is.
write it down. Cookies and caffeine.
Cookies and caffeine. But yeah, and then just figuring out ways to come alongside and brag on them, and I think is huge too. Letting them share is another thing. I think sometimes we can be so excited about what we're seeing, just let them share about how, I just want to hear and listen. What are you seeing in your group and what are you excited about?
Yeah.
So I think that's important.
Why do you think it's so hard for us to celebrate our leaders like we should? Because I feel like that's like, I feel like a lot of people might hear some and be like, oh yeah, I should totally do that. And I don't.
Right.
But it's hard. So I'm curious, like, what you guys think, like, what are the obstacles that creep up in the lives of ministers or staff members who are coordinating these things that keep them from moving towards that?
Again, I think we're often purpose-driven. We communicate the process, but then we lose the person in that. And so I think it's very, very easy to think, okay, this is my event, this is what I have to accomplish, and that person is a part of the cog in the machine of that. It is very easy to get that mentality. And the fact of the matter is this: in order for the organic to happen, there has to be organized. Like you have to have some type of organizational structure.
That's a
like
t-shirt.
There is a process,
right?
right?
That's a t-shirt, yeah.
That's a t-shirt?
Yeah.
Cookies and
Get on
caffeine.
the back.
Cookies and
Sponsored by
organic.
Cookies and
Organized,
Caffeine.
organic. I love it.
So you have to have those things,
Yeah.
right? But here's the thing, I think especially for millennial and Gen Z leaders, right? If you're communicating, hey, process, they're not going to
They're gonna
connect
be
to that.
out.
Yeah, they wanna be
They're going to
known.
shut you
Yeah.
down immediately. And so using terms like leadership pipeline, using terms like that, you're going to disconnect that person. However, if
What's
you
the
are
trendy way to say pipeline?
Straw.
Ooh,
What?
Leadership straw.
okay.
I'm just kidding.
It's like, is that
I guess
real?
that's
That's not
right.
a t-shirt. Yeah, no.
Leadership
I-
straw.
There's not a
Can
trendy
we
way,
edit that out?
but because it comes down to relationships in the person, right?
Yeah.
And so there is a leadership pipeline. Why? Because you're developing and pouring into them,
Yeah.
right? With the goal that hopefully they're going to pour into somebody else. But what you don't do is you don't give like the mechanics behind it all. Like you can enjoy the food that you eat, but you don't want to know how it's fully made, right? And so very
Amen
much.
to that.
And so there's an element where we behind the scenes are helping create the organizational things
Okay.
that allow them to flourish. And hopefully that we are encouraging, building them up so that they will be healthy leaders that will help build healthy leaders.
So is there a way then, kind of in, I'm going to use a technical term here, proxemics, like the different size groups that you're a part of, like where does that break down, right? Because I'm thinking of Jesus and the 3 versus Jesus and the 12.
Yeah.
Like, where do you think that's like? Because obviously we're just people. Like we can't do all of these things.
Yeah.
Right.
Infinitely. Like there's got to be a time where we just say, yeah, I just don't have the capacity to do that. So I'm just curious where that breaks down for you guys. Like as
Yeah.
you try to lead large groups of people intentionally, and you're recognizing, and you're not just doing processes, you're not using those big, confusing words like pipeline, but you're trying to know the person. Like where does that break down capacity wise for us as leaders?
Yeah, I mean, I think because ministry is messy, and
Yeah.
you start having crisis moments pop up, and it's hard to be thinking about celebrations when you're like, this is a mess right now. But I
Yeah.
think you have to do it with a team of people.
Yeah.
I think it's who is it that naturally is thinking about celebrating, right? Like, I just think bringing those people on board to be like, can you be our celebration person, or can you make sure that this is happening?
Yeah.
But also scheduling it. I think you need to make sure you
And
make it
I
priority.
think that's because when I was in student ministry, the student ministry that I worked for was called FSM, and we every year, same time every year, had an event called the FS Emmys, where we rolled out the red
sweet.
carpet, everybody dressing nice. We're handing out superlatives.
Yes.
But it's a marked moment on the calendar. It's a rock.
Yep.
And it's a helpful kind of accountability or boundary of saying, hey, this is so we don't forget to do this. Like, we're going to put this on the calendar every year, same time, same place, same thing, to make sure that we're celebrating people.
Yeah.
We do at our campus 2 large, we call them trainings, okay? But the first training that happens in the winter is much more looking at goals for the year, looking at purpose, looking at that. But the one in the fall is more looking back and celebratory.
Yeah,
and so
love
usually when we cater in food or if we make food,
Yep.
it's usually a little bit better for that one. It's also celebrating wins. So
Yep,
ahead of
that's
time,
right.
what I'm doing is I'm compiling, like, hey, where have you seen God move in your group? So we're celebrating baptisms that have happened this past year. Well, we're celebrating, like, hey, for some groups, consistency meeting. This was a great year for us because we consistently met and nothing fell apart. And that's a win for them in that situation.
Sure.
For others, it looks like very different things. But that one is making sure that do we have a time for that celebration, looking back? Because if we're always looking forward, we're not going to see what God's done in our midst in the back. So
Yeah,
We're
that's
having,
good.
we do that as well with our leaders, but then also with our groups as well. So like midweek tonight, we're having a soda bar tonight.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
A soda bar.
a soda bar.
What is
and
that?
so-
very Utah of us.
Yeah,
Come
like-
on.
What?
It's like swig, but not Mormon.
Yes.
I'm
So-
more confused than I was before. I
Did you know
don't
what-
know what's happening.
Do you know what swig is?
No.
I think this
You
is
can look it
funny
up later,
as well.
yeah.
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 But here's what we're doing in student ministry world. We used to have it at the beginning and at the end, but I want to make sure that all throughout we're celebrating as well. So tonight is in between of 2 book studies, and so we're going to have
That's nice, yeah.
something just a little bit of a celebratory time. So they get to have sodas, and I know that sounds
Just the
real
little things,
exciting.
right?
Just
Yeah.
a little thing. Just make your own soda and put a little syrups and stuff in it.
Okay.
do you know what that is?
I think we
Yeah.
call it pop where I'm from, but
Where are you from?
the North.
I'm from the North,
Wait,
Where?
Illinois.
I'm from Indiana.
I mean, we did soda, like soda pop.
That explains a lot.
Soda pop.
Well, we are in Tennessee. Coke is usually what they say here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't do that.
Yeah.
So. That's too far. But anyway,
Yes.
but we also do at the end of our midweek with our leaders, we'll have like a nice catered meal
Yeah.
and that sort of thing. So I think it's important to do all the way through, not just at the end of the beginning, but like with our mentors with Flourish, we're trying to make sure we have 4 different worship nights. So we're scheduling those all the way through. So I think sometimes it can be hard to make it to the end, right?
Yeah.
Sure.
But scheduling is key for sure.
I think Amy Jo brought up a really good point about trying to do it all, right? And I think especially even when you were talking about how Jesus had his 3 and had his 12, depending upon what your personal capabilities are, there's some people, they're just like Energizer bunnies. They can do a lot. There's other people, their capacity is different. God's made each of us kind of unique when
built
it comes to
different.
that.
Yeah.
But same thing, depending upon the ministry that God's given you, what that looks like is you may have a multitude of groups. You may have a few. And so how do you develop, some people call them coaches, some of them call them kind of like leaders for your leaders. How do you develop people to kind of help in that in between? Because the fact of the matter is, based upon your own capabilities, you can only do so much.
Yeah.
And so have you all seen, like kind of in your experience, how developing and pouring into specific leaders has helped pour into other leaders?
Yeah. I mean, this isn't necessarily like an issue that we have at our campus because we're so small. Like I was telling somebody earlier, like I have all my leaders in a group text.
Yeah.
It's not overwhelming.
Yeah.
Like it's easy to kind of keep in the loop with them. But in past ministry seasons where that wasn't the case, like, when I would read the story of like Jethro and Moses and Jethro coming to Moses and be like, hey, bro, this is not sustainable. You need to delegate some of this.
CSV.
Yeah, that's that's true. The extra spiritual version says that, yeah. But I think there's such a value in something like a coach because they can be that bridge between a leader and a staff member, so that the staff member has the capacity to care and do other things,
Yeah.
and they're not constantly having to turn to the side or answer questions that could have been fielded or worked through someone like a coach who is maybe a little seasoned, has more experience, who, maybe they've got a lot of things going in life. Maybe they're a major CEO or something and they don't have time to lead a group, but they're still interested and willing to serve, then it's easy to say, well, hey, why don't you just be a coach where you kind of help shepherd our leaders in different ways? Go to coffee with them, take them to dinner, answer their questions, share your story, that kind of thing. That can just be a really helpful bridge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen the huddle group model where you kind of delegate and bring a couple of leaders together with a seasoned leader, and I think that's a really great way to be able to delegate the care of your group leaders. And so you can't do it all, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm training up somebody right now who is getting ready. I realized, when we've launched mentors, that is a whole new group of people, and so I realized that I can't do it all. So I have to bring somebody on alongside of me to come and help bring a network of checking in with our leaders. So yeah, that's
again,
important.
I feel like it elevates the impact of the footprint, right? Because again, there's only so much that we can do by pouring into those individuals. It creates a larger scope for ministry. I think one thing that's also important within all this is realizing that different groups need different amount of care itself. There are some group leaders who they're rock stars, they're all stars, they've been doing it for a while. They by no means need as much as someone who's starting out.
That's right.
Or maybe just going through a season where things are just tough. And so I think we have to be extremely strategic with our care and not always trying to give equal care. Because if we're doing so, sometimes we are really undervaluing some people. And then sometimes the people who are really just doing really well, they may get frustrated with that as well. And so...
Do you find too, though, with that, because I have talked with leaders who don't need as much check-in, yet sometimes we forget them, and then it's like,
never done
they're
that
a
one
bitter
before.
bear, like you got to make sure you check in.
Yeah.
So do you find... Yeah, how do you guys do that? Do you schedule that as well? I mean, you almost have to have an infrastructure of care and check-in and celebration, right? Like just to make sure that you're scheduling, we haven't checked in with Betty and Bob for a long time, who's doing that? You can forget, right?
Yeah.
So how do you handle that? Do you do that?
Yeah, I have organized times where I know I'm doing check-ins with my leaders. And so I will have both in-person check-ins every spring. I'll have an in-person with a coffee or lunch with my leader just to talk about the past year, how things are going, and talk about the future.
Right.
But we also, again, depending upon which leaders they are, it looks like kind of a monthly check-in. How are things going? How's the groups? What that looks like as well. And so, again, dependent upon what that leader needs. Because there's some leaders, things are going well. We have communication. Things are great. Right. There's other leaders who I know need help. There's other leaders who think they don't need help, but they do need help, right? I think some leaders can be, maybe they're overly cautious, right?
Those are great.
Or maybe they're kind of that bulldog kind of leader where they're headstrong and they don't think they need help, but at the same time, overall with the mission and purpose, what's going on, there needs to be a little bit more oversight and checking with that. And so I think that's where the strategy comes in, where we have to be organized in our approach. When we reveal all that organizational structure, it doesn't look as pretty, right?
Yeah.
But it's needed in order for people to gather together and to develop those leaders.
Yeah, and maybe with those leaders that are, capable, they don't need those regular check-ins. A check-in might still look like getting a cup of coffee and not talking about their group.
That's right.
But just spending time with them, like you're talking about whatever just happened on the news or whatever, like you're spending time with them again, which I think would accomplish what you were saying about recognizing and valuing the person and not just like relegating them to a part of the process. So just make it a goal to get that face time with them. For me, especially if I'm going to do that, I'm going to make sure I'm not on church property. Because if I just do it at church, it feels like there's a tendency or a possibility where they're just going to say to themselves like, oh, he's just doing his job. And if we're at a coffee shop or we're somewhere else, there's a less temptation for them to feel like I'm just checking a box or doing a project. That's just something that I found helpful.
That's good. I had a leader just even a couple of years ago, because we're always learning, right? And she made a comment. We ended up having dinner, and I usually was doing coffees. And I don't know if this has ever happened to you before, but she was just like, oh, we've never had dinner before. And I was like, okay, but it made me realize that sharing a meal, sometimes if I'm only doing coffee, is that communicating this is a quick thing? I don't know if that's a thing for females or if you guys ever find that with guys as well, but it made me begin to think differently about even, I hadn't thought location, but also what what is it even sharing? Like if I'm saying, let's share a meal together, that shows more about the person. I care about you. I'm going to sit down and invest some time.
Yeah. And that's why I try to avoid emails. Like I'll send emails if I have to, but an email can just be really impersonal, and it feels impossible to like communicate tone well or receive tone well in a written email. Like I can tell you so many times where I've gotten an email from somebody and thought, what did I do? Or like I've tried to communicate this to our pastor. When he says, come in my office, sends me a text, and there's a period at the end of it, I'm immediately like, well, I'm fired. Like, I might as well start packing my bag and I'm out. When he might just want to be like, did you see like that game last night? Yeah. And I'm like, you could, like, this is an exclamation point. Yeah. Like there's communication here. There's a breakdown.
Or the ellipses, the dot, dot, dot. Yeah.
Don't ever do the dot, dot, dots. So
communication, I think that's where multiple touches are. Again, emails are great. Emails are great for a large amount of communication, but looking at others. Well, one thing I definitely want to get y'all's advice on, or what would you give one piece of advice for someone who's trying to restructure their small group, okay? And so let's say there's a minister or a volunteer or someone who oversees small groups at their campus or in a department at their church. What would you say is, if they're trying to restructure, okay, what was a piece of advice you would say, hey, this would be beneficial to think through?
Yeah, I always just come back to that flexibility piece. Like, don't be afraid to try new things. Like, strategy is absolutely necessary. And there is an infinite pool of resources on leadership development and spiritual leader, to the point where it's overwhelming. And I would encourage you to find a voice that really connects with you, that you have learned from, and just sit in that pond. Like, don't go read all the other books. Just read all the books or the material that this one person or two people have made. Narrow your scope, sift through what works for you guys and what doesn't. But do yourself a favor and don't overwhelm yourself with thinking, I have to recreate the biggest, the brightest ministry that can exist. And just don't be afraid to try new things. Like, and own it, right? If you take a risk, you gotta own it when it doesn't pan out. Sure. You gotta put your stamp on it, but don't be afraid.
Yeah.
I would also say make sure that you have a pulse on the people, right? Yeah, so if you're going in and going, I want to do this, but they're not ready for that, or just trying to figure out like what are the needs, what's and why are you wanting to make a change? So I think you need to bring other people into that and don't be in a vacuum making those changes, right? And restructure on your own. Make sure you have people that are pouring into that and praying into that, right? So
I think it's really easy to look at other churches and other ministries saying, I want to be like that, right? And you're trying to take people and copy that. But one thing I love about Elevate and Elevate Conference we're trying to do is we're not saying, hey, copy us, copy this. We're saying this is how we do certain things, and it's been beneficial for us. And so I think one of the key things is we're not trying to copy or replicate another ministry. Don't do that. What's the pulse of your people? What do they need? And how do you bring people along in that? And the fact of the matter is, culture does not change overnight. It starts with the leader, and it starts with developing those leaders. And then over time, that culture will change. And so realize that it is a long process when it comes to that.
Yeah, I think that's great. Great point.
Just as we kind of wrap up a little bit, I want to talk about kind of encouragement and next steps. What's one shift a church could make this year to strengthen their group leadership pipeline? If there's just kind of the first step, if they're kind of going from we don't really have a pipeline process, I kind of just find a leader and bring them in. What's one thing that they can do to kind of help in the leadership pipeline of their church for groups?
Yeah, this is something that I have seen a lot of value in over the last few years, but I would say tighten up your leadership covenant. If you don't have one, make one. Because I think there's a temptation to just ask someone to step into leadership and leave it there. But I think what's happening is we're missing an opportunity to call our leaders to something bigger and more specific, right? And we know that Scripture is full of covenantal language, like it's a part of our faith. And I think that we should lean into that when we're asking our people to lead in such an impactful way. And so I would say, if that's a aspect of your ministry that you don't have, maybe spend some time thinking through what it would look like to draft out a covenant and asking and expecting leaders to follow it, because that's where things can get hard, right? They signed the leadership covenant, but I really need them, and they're really key and influential. So I can't do anything about it. But I think there's a measure of accountability there that's helpful for us as leaders to challenge each other and to grow and continue to push each other further up and further in. And I think a covenant can do something like that.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think that's a great idea. I also think making sure that your mission and vision is clear, and a formal time where you're just reminding and training and equipping, and this is why we do this. This is what, what this is about. And then also, what are we praying for? I think that's huge. I love and want to remember always that, yes, we've been given leadership over this group, but it's only given from God. And we have to make sure that we're surrendering that to Him and inviting Him to move in and through our groups. We can plant seeds, right? But it's God that is going to grow our groups. And so, so invite our leaders into that too. And let's pray together and see what God does,
I think that's key. You started with the first kind of comment you made was all about prayer. And I think that kind of ending on that note where it is very much about prayer. The people that we have in our specific ministries, in our groups, I truly believe that God brings those people.
That's right.
Right? And that only happens if we pray for them, right? But also the leaders that will develop, that starts and ends with prayer itself. And so how do we get our overall leaders on board when it realizes, hey, God's the only one who's going to do the growth here? I think is so key. One last thing, and then we'll end it here. What's one thing you wish you would have known early on about creating layers of leader development? So this idea of layers of leadership, where it's not all about you and the next person, but making sure that there's other people in the process. What do you wish you would have known early on about that?
That's a big question.
It is.
That's why we waited to the very end for this one.
I'm not good at inner child work. My therapist and I are still trying to figure that out. But I shared this a little earlier, I think leadership can be very overwhelming. And, when you're trying to think about how to be a good leader, it can get even more overwhelming again with what I was saying earlier about the amount of just like information and things that are out there. So I think for me, I wish I would have known, or I could tell myself like, hey, just pick one thing to get better at for a season. You don't have to be, Superman. You're allowed to make mistakes. Mistakes are actually helpful, and they're part of this process to make you a better leader. But just like narrow in on one thing at a time that you want to grow in, whether that's, so for me, as an example, this past few years, I have tried to grow in my productivity, like how I'm using my time, how I manage details and that sort of thing. I'm not really that, it's not my personality. And so I bought like this little time cube that I flip around that helps me segment my time really well. And then I got a software that helps me keep track of tasks, and I hate them all, but they're helpful. And I've gotten better at being productive. And I accomplished my goal. And now I find the next thing that I want to get better at. And so I think just take it one step at a time, one piece at a time.
I mean, I'm going to go back to when early on, when I first started and was learning to recruit leaders, I made some not bad, but just rookie moves where, again, I just...
Rookie moves.
There it is. I just put people in that said they wanted to lead, and I didn't... It caused bigger problems down the road, and really got convicted because the Lord was like, you never asked me. You never asked me for the leaders. And so I have learned I'm going to ask Him for the leaders, I'm going to pray for the right ones. I'm going to pray for how to grow the right ones. Does it make sense? And because it was harder removing toxicity than getting to celebrate Him growing those leaders. Does that make sense?
I think that makes complete sense.
Yeah.
I think for me, it's kind of along similar lines where I very much thought I had to do it on my own. So I'm finding the leaders, I'm recruiting.
That's exactly
And
it.
especially when I did college ministry, because that was my background before being at this current campus, where it was easy to find college students who were just vibrant, they want to be involved, and you can plug and play. They don't have a lot of leadership experience, and they want to be in it, right?
Yeah.
And so they're all new to it, so you can kind of create that culture pretty fast. But then coming into a church that's had groups that have met almost longer than I've been alive. I mean, you have groups that have been going on when they had kids and now they have grandkids
Legacy
and great-grandkids.
That's right.
They're legacy, right?
Yeah.
And there's certain current culture within that. How do you change and kind of implement some of those things? And so realizing that takes time. That also takes building relationships. And so it's one of those things that God's going to do the growth. You got to trust him in that process. And I love what both of you all said. It all comes back to prayer in this, where we are very much wanting and seeking after God to do the work. And so how do we come alongside him? And because it's his ministry that he's doing. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode on identifying leaders and building layers of group coaches. If today's conversation sparked some ideas for your ministry, I want to invite you to the Elevate Church Conference, a one-day event designed to equip your entire team with role-specific breakouts, inspiring keynotes, and networking with church leaders from across the country. Learn more and register at elevatechurchconference.com. Check out the show notes for the resources and additional insights, and we'll see you next time on the Elevate Podcast.